How do we protect our kids from the challenges of pornography today? Does porn really harm marriages and relationships and individuals? How concerned should we be about this? My friend Dr. John Foubert has written what now will be my top book that I will recommend. It's called Protecting Your Children from Internet Pornography. There's a ton of research in this, John, but it's short, it's to the point, and it's practical. It's a great book. And before I bring you in, just give our audience a sense that might be wondering about you writing this. You have done a ton of practical research behind this book and working and speaking in the area of sexual assault for years. You've written several times for CNN, NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, and you've testified before Congress and called upon by the White House and Pentagon about how to work with people to end sexual violence. So you have spoken into this issue for years. So thanks for coming on the show and just writing a really, really good book.
Absolutely. I just appreciate you having me.
Well, happy to do it. I'm a parent and I work with students. And any man or woman who lives today can experience the temptation and ravages and effects of pornography in a range of ways. So really want to talk about it on this show and bring some of the truth to the surface and to empower us to address it better. So tell us a little bit more about your research and experience you bring to this study of pornography and sexual violence.
Well, I've been doing research on sexual violence since 1993, and about in 2008, I began to see a connection between pornography and sexual violence that interested me.
Mm,
And once I saw that connection, I started to do more research on pornography, on what the journal articles were saying about it. And I was just stunned at the devastating harms that this was doing. And at the same time, I also noted that there were people who I knew in the church who were really going down because of this horrible menace. And so I felt myself called to do something for the church, and felt myself also wanting to do more research to demonstrate the harms of pornography, and then both do studies that showed pornography's harms and also put it in a more practical format in books
mm.
so that people could really understand what the harms were and apply it to their own lives.
Given that this is such a sensitive topic on so many levels, is there any kind of caution you might give to people before we jump in? Because we're going to look at pretty starkly at what the data shows and the harm that results from pornography.
Yeah, I would say if you're easily squeamish, or if, for example, you might have been sexually assaulted, that
Mm,
these conversations can be difficult for you because we will be talking about sexual violence. Much of pornography is sexual violence from my perspective. And so we
mm.
will be talking directly about that. And so I would just caution people to enter this conversation with some degree of predation, and understanding that what we're talking about is pure evil, and that can be difficult to talk about
Well,
and listen to.
yeah, that is very true. Before we get into some of that data, what do the most reliable studies show about how many people are actually watching pornography? And is there a difference between Christians and non-Christian porn consumption?
Well, yes. The research on pornography consumption essentially comes into different categories. One is, have you ever seen pornography? And when you ask
Okay.
adults about that, about 93 to 97% of men have, and around 85, 87% of women have at some point in their lifetime. Now, that could just be a pop up, or it could be daily use. Some of the more, I think, realistic data um, show that on a monthly basis, there was a study done of 18 to 23-year-old, um, or 18 to 20, excuse me, 18 to 30-year-old men and women, finding that 79% of men in that age group looked at pornography at least monthly, and
Mm.
29% looked at least daily. About 42% of women in that age group, 18 to 30, looked at pornography at least monthly, and about 7% at least daily. So it's something that is really pervasive of our culture. And I think we're now in the age of ubiquitous porn.
Well, that's a huge disparity between 29% of men in that age range who look at it daily and 7% of women. So it seems to be growing, and this is an issue that crosses gender boundaries, so to speak. But there are some
It
significant differences too.
it does, and most pornography is geared towards the male consumer. But
Mm,
one of the things that the pornography industry noticed is that they have a real growth market potential with the female market, and so they've made some pornography that's intended to be seen by women consumers, and those numbers of women consuming pornography have thus increased.
I realize there's exceptions, but are men and women, males and females, generally drawn to different kinds of pornography?
When you talk about pornography from a large scale, in terms of including written pornography, women tend to be more drawn to the romance novels, the
Mm,
written pornographic scenes, and some of the more tame visual pornography. Men tend to be more interested in the more hardcore and violent pornography, generally
mm.
speaking. That doesn't speak for every man and every woman, but they do tend to look at different things, and they do tend to use it in different ways.
So, my dad is matched up with that, and I haven't researched it as extensively as you have. But one of the things I also want to know is, do men and women tend to look at porn for different reasons? So, not only different kinds of pornography, but different motivations or reasons shaping the kind of porn that they're choosing to watch.
Absolutely. I mean, the number one reason why men look at pornography is to facilitate masturbation,
Mm,
because it's an excellent facilitator of masturbation, because it gets people thinking in a sexual way, and then it helps with that process. For women, they tend to use it to please a partner. So there again, the emphasis is on the man usually, but they're either shown it by men as an
mm,
instructional video of here's what I want us to do together, or they are reading the more romance novels where they're in it a little bit more for to think about it in terms of a romantic encounter sense rather than a pure hardcore sexual interaction.
mm. Let's talk about kids for a moment. I mean, I hear studies of kids who are 6, 8, 10 years old being exposed to pornography, at times viewing it regularly, but the data seems to show it's a little bit older on first exposure. What is the most reliable data that you have indicate when kids at least first encounter porn?
I think we need to recognize that there's going to be variability in that. There's going to be variability in the sense of if kids have older brothers and sisters who may
Mm,
show it to them, or older friends, they may see it as a younger age than at other with other kids, and that there's a cutoff right around eighth grade. So about half of eighth graders have seen pornography. So that really seems to be a tipping point. And it's really around there where if they don't already have a cell phone, their friends have cell phones and are showing them pornography on those devices. Because, of course, the world's supply of pornography can be found on any cell phone that a kid has. And a lot of parents don't necessarily realize what they're giving their children. They just think they're giving them a phone, but they're really
right.
giving them the world's supply of pornography.
How would you define pornography? Because for me, I typically would define it as any sight, image, or sound that is intended to create sexual arousal, which distinguishes it from art. What would you say?
Yes. I would say exactly what you said. I think
Mm,
it involves some sort of visual depiction, usually involving the genitals or sex acts. And if it's a picture, there tends to be some penetration involved, or
mm.
some nudity showing the genitals.
So we're going to get into a lot of the harm of pornography, but I'm curious why you wrote this book. My hope is that a ton of people pick it up. And I think it's naturally going to, when people see protecting your children from internet pornography, at least conservative parents and Christian parents, and I think many others immediately have this sense of, oh my goodness, I am concerned for my kids. And some maybe don't even want to pick up the book because they're afraid, like, now I'm going to be accountable for the information. There could be a range of reasons why, but why do you think in particular many adults are reluctant to talk with kids about porn?
I think adults are reluctant to talk to kids about porn because it's just an awkward conversation. I mean,
Mm,
talking about sex is awkward enough, but talking about pornography, is something altogether entirely different. They may be embarrassed about their own prior pornography use
Hmm.
and not want to get into that, or they simply may be uncomfortable with the subject matter. But one of the things I think parents need to realize is if we're not speaking into our children's experience with pornography, the pornography industry is happy to take our role in doing that.
Hmm.
And we really need to step up to the plate to have ongoing conversations with our kids about pornography, which is one of the reasons why I wrote the book Protecting Your Children from Internet Pornography, because I wanted to empower parents with the information that they need in terms of the harms of pornography, but also to give them specific questions that they can ask their kids to facilitate those ongoing dialogues that I think are so necessary to raise our children.
Well, you do that in an age appropriate way at the end of each chapter. It's like, here's specific questions of conversation to have with young kids, teenagers, young adults, etc. I think people just don't know how to have this conversation in many cases. I think that's one piece of it. We think there's magic to it, where in many cases it's just listening, it's just talking, it's just sharing, it's not freaking out when the conversation comes up, and just helping kids be at ease. I've discovered many young people, if not most, are open and willing, if not eager, to have this conversation if we'll just do it in the right way with the right spirit at the right time. And that's why I think your book is super super helpful. My parents always taught me, my father, like, start young, because it's not only the porn industry, like you said, but it's going to seep through TikTok, it's going to seep through Netflix, it's going to seep through our educational system. That kind of pornified culture is everywhere, and it's speaking to our kids. But the data shows, as
Yes.
you know, parents have the biggest impact on their kids, and these other ones only step in when we don't. So talk about that for a second. What do you think often happens when parents just don't have this conversation, or churches don't have this conversation about sex and pornography?
Well, parents and churches are the most positive influencers of their children in terms of not looking at pornography. So it's really fighting a battle without any weapons. There's a battle going on for the souls of our children and for their sexuality. And the porn industry is fighting that battle very well. And they have lots of ways, as you mentioned, through different social media platforms and other ways to get to them. We need to engage that battle, both in the church to talk about pornography from the pulpit and in youth group, and from a parental perspective, from a very young age. We need to start having conversations with our children about pornography, and even more, or I would say just as important, have the kind of relationship with our kids where they can talk to us about anything,
Hmm.
and can really get the sense that if I have a question about something, I should go to mom or dad, not the internet, if I don't know what something is.
I love that you couch this in relationship. That's really the key, that there's trust and there's intimacy and there's love there, willing to talk about these really sensitive topics. So just maybe just give us some practical things, and then we're going to shift to some of the really damaging effects of pornography. But how do
Mhm.
you recommend just beginning this conversation? How early do you start? What does it look like? Maybe just give us some practical ways that you see this playing out with kids.
I would see starting conversations at the moment they really can understand and respond with language. So I'm thinking areas like 2 or 3 years old.
Okay.
And I wouldn't bring up the word pornography with them, but I would have a conversation with them like, how we have fun in our family taking pictures and looking at pictures of each other.
Hmm.
Now, of course, we wouldn't take a picture of someone without their clothes on, would we? No, we wouldn't do that. And so, if we wouldn't
Hmm.
take pictures of each other without our clothes on, showing our private parts, we wouldn't look at pictures of other people who are showing their private parts, because that would be just silly. We wouldn't want to do that. So, it gets a message in their heads from a very young age that there's just something wrong that we want to avoid. About looking at pictures of naked people, which I think is the way to phrase it with children. We don't want to, at a very young age, expose them to the word pornography. They can probably hardly pronounce it, let alone understand it. Um, but as they get older, around the age of 8, 10, I would then say, have you ever heard your friends talk about something called pornography? Do you know what it is? And I would give them more of a definition of it so that they are prepared in case it
Mm.
does happen, so it doesn't catch them out of left field.
That's really helpful. When my son was 8, he has an older sister and an older brother, and she made a statement about discussing abortion in class, and he goes, "Dad, what's abortion while we're driving?" Instead of freaking out, instead of changing the subject as best I could, I said, "Well, there's some times where a woman will get pregnant and she'll choose she doesn't want to keep the child. Why would she choose that?" And we had a conversation until his interest
Right,
shifted as just age appropriate and gracious and truthful as I could. And then we moved on. So I think that's
right.
the principle. Start young in age appropriate ways, be calm, have an ongoing conversation, and this empowers our kid. John, I remember I met a pastor's son a number of years ago, 20 years old. He's like, "My parents never talk with me. And I've made such devastating decisions that I don't even know if I can go back." Now, of course, he could, but that's how he felt at that moment. He's like, "I wish my parents had just simply talked with me."
I think that's so important. And one of the great pieces of advice I got from one of the therapists I interviewed for the book was to lead with your head, not with your heart, when you're having those
Mm.
conversations with your kids. And just think very matter of factly, very plainly, just give them the information they're asking for. So you're not creating this freak out moment and not having any anxiety on your part, or at least showing the anxiety you may feel, but having it be a natural conversation so that they being your children feel free to come back to you again if something else were to occur and they wanted to find out more information.
When I talk with students and other people about pornography, I talk a lot about the damaging effects of it, how it affects the
Mhm.
brain, the faulty sexual scripts, and we're going to get into that. But one of the narratives I found we have to counter is that there's so many porn stars who just give the impression, "Hey, I love my job. It's empowering, it's liberating, it's good for me and for my relationships." And you say that's not really true.
I do. I mean, I think you can always find a porn star who's willing to say it's empowering, but I would just like the an employee of a company, you would need to think about what is their organization telling them to say when they go out in public, which isn't
Mm.
always what they really feel. I think it's difficult for us to conceive of acts that porn stars are asked to do that involve vomiting
Mm.
after certain sexual acts, really painful intercourse in various ways. Doesn't really seem empowering to me. Now, is it possible that you could find one person who believes it's empowering? Certainly. But to a large majority of those in the porn industry, um, one of the things I've learned is that they really feel trapped in there and caught,
Mm.
and it's very violent. The one woman who I interviewed in my book who had left the porn industry talked about it as degrading and just a horrible experience. And I found that through my research to be more normative than an
Mm.
outlier.
I had a chance to interview Josh Broom, who's the 2012 Male Performer of the Year, and he just told how he was kind of sucked into the porn industry, the way he was treated, the lies that he believed, and certain just behind the scenes elements, like you describe, is not the image that's put forward to the public. And I really
Mhm.
do consider actors and actresses in porn films to be victims. They're victims. Now they choose to do it, but they're victims. Would you agree with that?
Right. I would absolutely agree with that, given the way that they're treated and some are raped as part of the scene, or they have to act out a rape. These are things that are just devastating to an individual's psyche. And a lot of the research on porn performers shows that they're much more likely to come out of a poverty situation and be really desperate for immediate funds to, for example, the one woman I interviewed was on the verge of homelessness with their 3 children, and had a choice between making a porn scene and being homeless. And it's
Jeez.
just I don't know those kinds of decisions. I've never had to make that kind of decision myself. So I think we need to be compassionate towards
Mm,
those in the porn industry and save our ire for those who are leading the effort to put out these images.
mm. When we start off, you talked about you discovered the link between your research on pornography and sexual violence. So I'm curious, how much do you think porn has contributed to the need for the Me Too movement in the first place?
I think porn has a tremendous effect on sexual violence. Now, I want to be careful to say everyone who watches porn isn't going to go out and rape somebody. We have to be very careful to say that. And in fact, those who are most affected by it are those who are predisposed to commit sexual violence.
Hmm.
But if they're predisposed to commit sexual violence and they use pornography frequently, they're 4 times more likely to commit sexual violence. So that's one statistic. Another is there've now been over 50 studies directly connecting pornography and sexual violence.
Hmm.
When you do 50 when you do 1 or 2 studies, you may want to be cautious about the results, but when you've done 50, you don't need to do 51. And when you actually do the math on 50 studies showing the same thing, what are the odds that that could happen just due to chance? It's 1 in 88 decillion. I mean, that is just a number that is almost impossible to imagine what that consists of. It's actually the only way that I can describe it is if you filled the Empire State Building floor to ceiling with pennies, and you had 1 billion Empire State Buildings, then you would have 88 decillion pennies.
Okay.
Um, and the people that are saying there's no connection between porn and sexual violence are saying, oh, well, I can go to that just random 1 of 1 billion Empire State Buildings to the random floor and that random room and pick out in the middle of the room that 1 penny just by chance. That's silly, and it's just not possible. So I view the connection to be very strong.
So I know people are going to say, okay, there's a connection because there's just correlation, but it's not causal. Explain that connection a little bit more to us.
Well, that's something that's a common thing that people will say. For example, all of the research connecting cigarette smoke to cancer is correlational. It's not.
Hmm.
It can't be causal because we can't like give 100 kids cigarettes and have 100 kids not have cigarettes and see who gets cancer. So a lot of the research is correlational, but when you find correlational studies and you repeat them 50 times in 50 different ways and you still find the same relationships, you can be pretty darn confident that there's something going on here.
Hmm. In some ways, it seems obvious to me. If you're going to watch something over and over again that depicts a script about how to treat somebody and how to find pleasure, again, we have choice, we have free will. It might not cause it, but to say it doesn't contribute and encourage and play at least a factor or a major factor, I think is just about as naive as it can get.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with you 100%.
Would you counsel somebody differently if they've looked at more softcore pornography as opposed to violent pornography? Because I ask, because oftentimes if I'm talking with students and they come to me and confess or want to talk about pornography, I want to know a few things. Okay, when did you start? How often do you look? What kind of pornography is this? And I want to make sure they know this is in grace and I'm not judging them. It just gives me a sense of where they are at and how this may be affecting them. So do you counsel differently? Is there a significant difference or not so much?
Well, there's some common things I would say, but there's some different things I would say. I
Okay.
think to someone who is just looking at softcore pornography, I would say get out while you can. Stop
Hmm.
before your brain is taken over by these images, and what your brain will begin to seek is more and more extreme images to get the same arousal. While you're still in softcore porn, this is the perfect time to quit because it won't be so difficult to quit. It's going to be a lot harder the more time you spend looking at pornography, the more frequently, the more violent the images are. That's going to trap your brain into a cycle that you will have a very difficult time getting out of. So get out while
Hmm.
you can.
Hmm. I appreciate you said it's not impossible to get out, but it gets harder and harder because of what it does to the brain. and we're gonna get into some of that. That was some of my favorite part of your chapter. I was reading it, going, yes, 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 because that's a lot of the same data I share with students. For some reason, it just sticks with them, so to
Yes.
speak.
Yes.
Before we jump into that, one of the things we hear over and over again, that isn't porn just a private act that isn't anyone else's business?
Well, it becomes other people's business when we interact with other people, because for on the one hand, it creates ideas for us about what sex should consist of, and that's awfully, if it's founded in pornography, that's awfully something that's violent. Um, it also, I've done several studies showing that the more people use violent pornography, the less likely they are to intervene to help someone who might be sexually assaulted. And so that's some of the bystander intervention research that I've been able to do to show, like I said, more violent porn more frequently, less likely to help someone who's sexually assaulted. So it really makes our communities less safe when we have people who are so strongly affected by a porn saturated culture. And also, I would say it affects the body of Christ. I mean, we're all part of the
Mm.
body of Christ, and those who call on His name for salvation and trust and believe in Him. And when we're all part of that same body, we need to be working together for common goals in terms of glorifying God, not in terms of satisfying some licentious desires in our own hearts.
That's a really interesting point about when people look at pornography, especially violent pornography, less likely to help somebody who's experiencing sexual violence or other violence. That's an example of what you see in the private carries out into the public. And I make this point a lot when it comes to sexual behavior, too. Well, yeah, it's meant to be behind closed doors, but if you get a sexually transmitted disease or pass it, if somebody gets pregnant, everything that child does in the public the rest of their life says, yes, this was conceived behind closed doors, but is constantly affecting people outside of those closed doors. And the same with pornography. And I think you're right to make that argument. And by the way, even pornography itself, the moment you're viewing it, is behind closed doors, but of somebody else, in many
Right,
cases, multiple people. And there was
right.
sound crew, there was a video crew, there's editors. This is a corporate kind of experience to create it, even if somebody views it behind closed doors. So it's really just, I think, a simple, misguided way to just say, stay out of my life. And it's like, no, if I love you and I love the larger community, I can't not say something because your actions are having a negative effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And every time we click on an image in pornography, that increases um, the advertising rates that they can charge for that particular site or whichever. So some people may think that, oh well, I'm just looking and nobody knows, and this doesn't affect anything. The other thing is, some of your larger porn sites, and even for that matter, some of your smaller porn sites, collect all kinds of information on you and violate your privacy.
Mm.
And so you may not realize what they're downloading based on your own behavior on their site, how they're trying to then give you images that will keep you on their site and transfer you over to paid type of subscription services.
That's something I say to students regularly. I say, even if you're not paying for this, every video you watch, every video you like, every single click is drawing attention and money and power to porn producers, which is contributing
Yes,
to the harm of society as a whole. So we don't get to have, if you click on anything, you don't get to say you're just a passive observer. You have started to contribute to the social cost of pornography.
absolutely. And it does have huge social costs.
Talk about how porn consumption changed, if at all, because I've heard numbers that it went up considerably during the COVID-19 pandemic. So did it change, and is it going back to the way it was before, or do we see things just kind of continuing on that trajectory?
One of the things we saw is that pornography use did increase. There were some of the larger porn companies that started to give away more of their paid content for free. And that
Hmm.
did result in a bump in use of pornography. And so it was about an increase of around 11% in pornography use with the COVID pandemic. We haven't yet had studies to see if it's gone down now that the COVID pandemic seems to be waning. But of course, there's some question as to whether COVID is really over or not. I think
Yeah.
it may not be as vast a problem as it was before, but it's still around. So when do you actually do a study to say this is now post COVID? That can be a little bit difficult.
That's fair.
But it did go up. It did go up with COVID.
Which makes sense when you think about it. People being locked up, people being lonely. There's so many factors that would seemingly contribute to that.
Hmm.
That is understandable why those numbers would grow. Talk about how big the porn industry is, and maybe one way to do this would be to compare it with major league sports like the NBA and the NFL, Major League Baseball. Like, how large is the porn industry?
The porn industry is a gigantic business, and it's important to understand it as a business as we analyze it. A lot of people don't realize that if you take the profits of Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, and National Football League, and all of their profits added up don't even lead to porn. Um, uh,
Gosh.
Porn leaves them in the dust. So the porn industry is making more than $13 billion a year. B is in billions, and that's just in the United States. Estimates are that worldwide it's making about 100 billion, which then you're getting into things like Microsoft size or Google size or those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of money to be made in pornography, and the people who are making it and distributing it, they want to make more and more money, and they want to keep their share of the market the same, and they're not really interested in having people hurt their business.
You hinted at this earlier before. Maybe clarify for us how exactly do they make this money? Because I could think about, say, the NBA, and they have, jerseys that they sell, tickets that people come to a game. They will license out to certain, NBC, TNT to air games, ESPN. So I understand the model of how major league companies will make money. How does the porn industry get $13 billion in the U.S.?
Well, the key thing for the porn industry is to have websites that have some free content and some paid content. And so they try to get you to go over to the behind a paywall at some point once they figure out exactly the kinds of images that you want to see. So that's one way. But another
Mm.
thing is there are many advertisements that are on porn websites. So ad revenue is huge in the porn industry, and those can be ads for sexual services of various kinds and varieties and other sorts of things. So there is just a whole lot of money in the sex industry, and that's being funneled in a lot of cases through websites that start off as free but try to get you into either paid services or paid images.
So is it similar to like Amazon and Netflix that if I watch a drama, then they're going to feed me more similar dramas because they're using artificial intelligence, and they've even created thumbnails based upon the demographic of people that will likely watch those particular shows on Netflix. Is the same kind of thing the porn industry does. They're just enticing you with a little bit that's free, and then they're using artificial intelligence to tailor the exact kind of pornography they think you will want from the information they gather to you, and then feed it to you and request money.
I couldn't have put it better. I mean that's
Wow.
exactly what they're doing, and it's kind of creepy if you think about it. That
Hmm.
the porn industry is collecting so much data on our children, on ourselves if we're using pornography. But any porn consumer, they're collecting all kinds of data on them, and it isn't data necessarily that you know that they're collecting. And so that's not data that we want shared, I would think.
So let's talk about this a little bit. We hinted at it earlier, but there's tends to be a chicken and the egg kind of problem here. What comes first? The emotional, moral, or spiritual issue, or physical, that drives somebody to pornography? Or is somebody looking at pornography and then it's driving them to behavior? So how does pornography positively shape attitudes and behaviors of people?
Well, pornography affects attitudes and behaviors in many different ways, but one of the whole chicken and egg question. There was a study done by Paul Wright at Indiana University, and he found that it is actually causal in terms of the pornographic images lead to the sorts of behaviors that we find objectionable. So, pornographic images lead to sex without protection, multiple partners.
Mm,
Um, Also can lead to other things like anxiety and depression. I mean, we hear that this generation is the most anxious and depressed in history. Well, one of the main reasons for that is looking at so much pornography. Um,
mm,
Pornography is such an uh, isolating product that it can make someone also feel much more lonely. And there's a vicious cycle between loneliness, pornography use, and more loneliness. So there are numerous harms of pornography that we don't even know are connected to our pornography use necessarily. When you think about, well, I'm real anxious and depressed, maybe I'll go look at porn. That's really going to make it worse.
mm.
And That's very devastating.
One of the ideas, again, you discuss in your book that I use a lot when I'm talking with students is the script of pornography. And
Hmm.
oftentimes I'll use the script of like, we have these ideas in our minds of how we behave in different settings. That's a script, but we don't even realize that we have those scripts are necessarily where we got them. So how we behave in an elevator is different than how you behave in a movie theater. That's different than how you behave in
Right.
a library versus how
Right.
you behave in any, at a football game, etc. We have all these ideas that we've adopted largely just from observing other people and seeing how they act. And it seems that pornography, if people view pornography, they're getting a script, so to speak, of expectations, what to experience, how to treat people. So, talk a little bit about that, what you mean by a script, if you'd add anything to that to make sure people are tracking, and what the script of pornography actually is.
Well, a sexual script is a psychological phenomena that basically states that we all have in our minds certain expectations of how a sexual encounter plays out. And when we're unpoisoned by pornography, that tends to include more intimate gestures and more loving gestures. When
Mm,
pornography gets in the way of our sexual script and rewrites the sexual script, it tends to rewrite it with more violent content and images and encouragement in those realms. For example, and I don't want to get too graphic, but
mm,
it's not a common behavior absent pornography for someone to want to dispel bodily fluids on someone else's face.
mm,
But that's something that's very common in pornography, and it's become more common in actual behavior because of the influence of the porn industry. So it's really a devastating impact that these porn scripts, the way that porn scenes tend to be shot, have affected the sexual behavior of people and how they're violent with each other. And it becomes normalized, and that's anything
mm.
but loving or God honoring.
So when we think about the effects of pornography, we talk about these scripts that we have that obviously aren't embedded in our brains. These are ideas in our minds, how we see the world and act out according to how we see the world. But you argue, and I think this is one of the most powerful parts of your book, that porn actually affects and rewires our brains. How does porn viewing physically affect the brain?
Well, what happens, it all has to do with dopamine. So, dopamine is a brain chemical that makes us want something and make us continue to go back to it because we want more dopamine. And so, when people initially look at tamer images, the Playboy variety, the some things that don't tend to involve a lot of violence, they get a dopamine hit in their brain that their brain says, "Ooh, I want that, and I want to return to that for the same feeling." Well, what happens after a while is your brain sort of gets tired
Mm,
of giving that high dopamine hit, and you realize, "Hey, I want that higher dopamine hit." And what your behavior then tends to be is to look for more and more extreme images to get the same level of dopamine hit in your body that you've had when you were looking at the tamer images. And it just traps you because you need more and more extreme images over longer periods of time more frequently to get that same dopamine hit. And your body starts to work against you because pornography presents what's called a supranormal stimulus, which is a type of stimulus that our brains weren't designed by God to
Hmm.
handle. Particularly with high speed internet pornography. Our brains weren't designed to handle
Hmm.
that many images that we can control so much at one period in time. Our brain is designed sexually for being with one other person, not to have the images of so many other people all at the same time. So it creates that supernormal stimulus that gives us a dopamine rush, but then gives us less and less of a dopamine rush. So then we try and go to more and more extreme porn, but we never quite get there to our first initial dopamine rush. And that creates a lot of frustration on the part of the individual.
One of the tensions I've tried to make sense of is pornography, like you said, is going to create the need for more and more variety, more extreme, and eventually act it out. But on the
Right.
flip side, it seems like with students, sexual behavior is down from the studies that I've seen about 10% from a decade and two earlier. So, does it discourage sexual behavior because it gives an outlet for some people, or does it encourage it because of the way the brain wires and works in the way you're describing? Or is it both?
I think it's both. I mean, I think we have seen a slight decrease in sexual behavior among this generation, but when they are interacting sexually, a lot of those interactions are more violent and
Hmm.
less loving and less designed to develop a connection with husband or
Hmm.
wife, for that matter. Um, so I think it is both, like you were saying.
How does pornography affect, let's say, romantic relationships? Because I remember seeing a study. It feels like it was from Netherlands or Sweden. This was years ago, and they argued that introducing pornography into a romantic relationship kind of spiced it up, and people were happier. And I just saw that. I'm like, I mean, is this a 2 week study or something like that? Like in the long
Yeah,
term,
yeah.
I'm not convinced. But do you have data to critique a study like that?
The data is overwhelming that pornography hurts marriages. And it
Hmm.
hurts marriages in a lot of ways. It creates unrealistic expectations in terms of what body size and type might look like compared to one's partner. It creates diminished life satisfaction, diminished marital satisfaction. The data are overwhelming, and also it makes it more likely the partners will cheat on each other the more they use pornography, and that certainly isn't very good for a marriage.
Hmm.
So can you find one couple that say, yes, this really helped our marriage? You're probably more likely to have the man say that than the woman. But
Interesting.
that as it may, it's statistically speaking absolutely devastating to a marriage.
Wow. That's a fact that needs to get out and not enough people are going to talk about. So, one of the sections that jumped out to me I thought was so interesting because I just hadn't given it a lot of thought is the connection between racism and the racial
Mm.
scripts that are often portrayed in pornography. It sure seems to me, if this is true, like you're arguing, this would be a huge point that people would be all over critiquing, and yet I don't hear it often. So let's start with how do you see racist scripts being demonstrated within pornography? What does the data show?
Well, the data shows that when men who are men of color, particularly black men, are shown in pornography, they're shown as being more violent. They commit more aggressive behaviors,
Wow.
and women who are women of color, particularly black women, are treated more violently than Caucasian women. So, and the most violence that occurs in pornography is between black couples, and
Hmm.
so it just gets to this trope that somehow black sexuality is a violent sexuality, which is horribly inaccurate. which we need to make sure that we're not trying to depict that, oh, a certain race is more violent than another race in their sexual behavior, because that's just not true in terms of the sexual data that we have on the population. But porn is showing them to be more violent, which I just think is deplorable, and it's racist at its core.
So, why would this be the case? If you had to guess, is it naivete? Is it racists that are producing this? Is it what the market is just demanding? So it's the market that's watching this is actually more racist, or is it just some combination of? How would you make sense of that, if at all?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to make sense out of. I think that
Hmm.
there is some racism in the part of people who are making it, and there probably is some racism in the part of people viewing it. But I think, as you said, it's a combination of factors that we haven't yet done the studies to tease them all out. Sometimes you know what the problem is, why the problem is there, and we know what the
Hmm.
problem is. We know there's racism in porn. We don't yet quite know why it's there. And so that's an area that's fruitful for more studies for people to do.
Yeah, I'll be honest, that is not a research study that I want to do. Whenever I write and research on
Yeah.
this, I honestly, I tell my wife, I'm like, hey, I'm studying this for season because I'm writing a talk, do whatever, and I'm moving on. Like, I don't want this in my mind anymore. So I want somebody else to do that. I don't want to do
Yes.
that research, but it needs to get done because that data needs to get out there. Uh, it definitely needs to get out there. So somebody with the right guidance, with the right mechanism, with the right accountability, that sounds like important research that needs to be done.
I'm particularly grateful to a lot of the secular researchers who actually involve looking at pornography to document the behaviors that are in there, so that a researcher like me can simply read a journal article
Mm.
to read what's there, that I never have to look at pornography to study pornography. It's like the same thing. You don't have to witness a murder to study murder. You don't have to witness pornography to study pornography.
Mm. Well, let me ask you just kind of as we get towards the end here to maybe role play a little with me in a couple just scenarios to give people a practical example what this would look like to talk with their kids. So
Sure.
I've got. Well, let's just take my son. My son is 9. He'll be 10 in a few months. What might it look like as a parent to talk with a say 8 to 10 year old appropriately about pornography?
I would ask him, have you ever heard the word pornography before? And what do you think it is? Have your friends talked about
Hmm.
pornography before? Um, and then, depending upon how that conversation goes, I would have conversations with him about, have any of your friends have cell phones or iPads? Do they ever show them to you? And what types of images do they show you? And do those images ever include pictures of naked people?
Hmm.
What was your reaction to that? How did it make you feel? So I would go on in that line of questioning with an 8 to 10 year old.
Okay, how about my daughter? She just turned 15, and I want to re-emphasize that you're saying you don't wait until 15 to have this conversation. In the model you're setting up, which I believe in, is it's having earlier, multiple age-appropriate conversations. But we just actually had a conversation last night about Snapchat. All her friends have it, and there are some sexual components within Snapchat and the anonymity of it. And we were just walking through a lot of details related to it and trying to be wise how we talk with her. But how would you talk about pornography with a 15-year-old girl?
I would ask her if she's seen pornography before and if her friends have shown it. And if she's had a boyfriend, I would ask, did your boyfriend ever show it to you?
Hmm.
Um, I would get into questions about, has anyone ever texted you a picture of themselves without clothes on, or even from the waist up? Um, to get a sense of what types of images are being viewed by that 15-year-old girl, um, and ask her how that made her feel, and whether that made her feel compelled to show images of herself without clothes on. Because
Hmm.
a lot of boys will be very tricky in getting girls to show themselves uh, in compromising positions, and then the boys not only look at those images, they share them with their friends, or
Mm,
they upload them to pornography sites, which you are never going to get that image back.
that's I'm glad to hear you say that. That's part of what our conversation was last night. Have people sent you these images? What are those images like? How do you respond when you see it? And just
Hmm.
really thinking through ahead of time what those scenarios may be like. How about
Right.
if how about if they say a high school kid, we'll assume it's a boy, but could be a girl in this case, comes to you and says, Dr. Foubert, I've been looking at pornography and I don't know what to do. I can't stop. I feel terrible. Help me. What would you say?
I would say find an accountability partner. I would say get Covenant Eyes or one of the other internet filtering and software programs for your phone, and have someone else set the settings of your phone so you can't look at pornography. And turn on things like Google Safe Search and Covenant Eyes, like I mentioned. And um, I would also, I think there's a lot of wisdom in James 5:16 that we're supposed to confess our sins to one another
Mm,
so that we might be healed. Find someone that you can talk to, so that you can regularly hold yourself accountable to them for not looking at pornography, and have them pray for you. The greatest power in the universe is prayer,
amen.
and you can get it through that. So, and I would recommend that that individual talk to their pastor about what's going on, or sometimes in larger churches you'll have Christian counselors that work there. Talk to them as well. But um, I would, my goal in talking to that individual is to figure out, what are you doing now to try to control your porn use, and how can we get you one step further towards recovery. Whether that, so if you don't have a porn filter or software on your phone, get it. If you're
Mm.
not seeing a counselor, see one. And whether that's a biblically based counselor or a certified sex addiction therapist, a CSAT, that's what I would recommend. But do at least one more thing than you're doing right now, and don't feel wallowed in, oh, I can't do anything about this. Yes, you can. God gave us free will, and God gave us the ability to both start a behavior and to stop a behavior. It just may be very hard, but with His help, you can do it.
Now, your book isn't so much a legal strategy, how to counter pornography. It's not how to create films that show the destructiveness of it. It's for parents, for youth leaders, for grandparents, any caring adult who says, I just want to be equipped to understand what's going on and how to have conversations with and protect my kids from the harm of this. Uh,
Yes.
so, is this because you think the legal strategy is not worth the time? Is this because this is just your lane? Because I know there's been some movements in the UK, in certain states in the US, to try to make certain ages of people that can't get on certain sites, to make certain pornography, you have to opt in instead of out. Like, what's
Hmm.
your sense of the larger political strategy and the more parental strategy you're taking in this book?
Yeah, I look at this being my lane in terms of documenting the harms of
Okay.
pornography, talking about how devastating it is, and helping parents talk to their kids about it. There are lots
Hmm.
of good people who have law degrees, who are working with legislators and giving testimony in that sort of sphere. And certainly, if I were called to give testimony in favor of an anti-porn bill, I would do so. But
Okay.
it's not been my lane necessarily. I think I'm better suited to really shocking people's consciences over how harmful porn is, and getting them to make a change as a result.
So I did notice that in your book, and this is a strategy that my dad will take as well. Like a few times you say, I want to shock you. And everybody wants to shock with everything to sell a product today that it almost doesn't mean anything unless you double, triple, quadruple shock. So I'm curious, why is that your strategy? And why is this shock worthy versus other things where sometimes we just feel like shock fatigue?
Yeah, I think a shocked conscience promotes changes in behavior. And there's a lot of good social psychological research that you don't want to overly shock an individual, because they may just sort of resist it and say, oh, well, that can't be true.
Mm,
Um, but you do want to give them good data, good information that they would find surprising, to kind of help to rework how they're thinking about an issue and reset their
Mm.
point of this is why I should be concerned and what I should do about it.
That's fair, and I didn't think you overstated in here. I just think you use that language sometimes, which jumped out to me. I kind of didn't expect it. Maybe give pause and go, "Wow, he's really studied this, and is
Yeah.
profoundly concerned about this." I should be too. Is putting myself in the position of the reader. I think that's what you're going at. Before I wrap up, did I miss? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't think your average individual has the time to read 300 peer-reviewed studies on porn, read 25 books on porn, talk to the 25 most common researchers on pornography, and then interview lots of people about their porn use. But I can do that and pare it all down
Mm.
in a book format that's easily read and understandable so you can benefit from all that time. I put a lot of time into this. I continue to put a lot of time into gathering the data so people can read it in a digestible format as opposed to a peer-reviewed journal article.
Well, it's 130 pages, and there's practical stuff at the end of each chapter. And I hope this comes across the way I intended. I think if I had the time to sit down and write a book, I would hope that it would look like this, in the sense that I just agreed with so many of the points that you made, the lengths of the chapter, the research, the practical steps for people. For those of you watching, I mean, 130 pages as you get to the end. It's a quick read. Again, the title is just Protecting Your Children from Internet Pornography by Dr. John Foubert. Thanks for coming on. Did I miss anything?
No, you didn't. This has been a great conversation. God bless you.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us.
Okay.